information session regarding mobile licensing. My name's Lisa Lyons, and I'm the Director of Legislative Services. I'd like to introduce the staff team who are here with us tonight to present information, answer questions, and capture your feedback. So please welcome Flynn Scott, the Manager of Regulatory Services, Kieran Sani, Deputy Clerk, Leslie Long, Special Projects, Florence DePassio, Supervisor of Licensing and Parking, Jennifer Lindsay, Municipal Licensing Enforcement Officer, Shelley Andrews, Municipal Enforcement and Property Standards Officer, Corey Sturgeon, Legislative Services Associate, Catherine Bezbiak, Records Analyst. She's out doing the sign-in. And Amber Blackburn, Communications Specialist. And also joining us tonight from York Regional Police is Constable Castle and Sergeant St. Amon. So I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the members of council who are present this evening with us, including Deputy Mayor Vey and Councillor Woodhouse. So we'll start with some housekeeping. Please make sure you sign in, as we will ensure that you receive notification when any further information on these subjects is being presented to council for consideration. Also, make sure you've picked up a clicker, the little gadget that you've probably seen at the sign-in table. That way you'll be able to participate in an interactive presentation this evening. The washrooms are located just outside the chambers to the right. And please make sure you turn off all your electronic devices to your silent mode. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is for staff to provide an interactive presentation regarding mobile licensing and some of the current and potential future regulations around some key business areas. You will be able to use your clickers throughout the presentation to answer certain questions, and the results will be immediately displayed on the screen for you to see. We will not be taking questions during the presentation, as there is a lot of information to cover. However, after the presentation, staff will be available at all of these breakout tables around the chamber, and will be happy to take questions and to receive your feedback. The presentation is being recorded tonight and will be uploaded to our website so that those who were unable to attend this evening can view the presentation and provide their feedback through an online survey afterwards. Again, we'd like to thank you for attending this evening, for listening, and for helping to inform the direction of the town's mobile licensing program. I'll now turn the floor over to our manager, Flynn Scott, who will take us through the presentation.
I'll lower this down for my height. So good evening, everyone. As Director Lyons mentioned, my name is Flynn Scott. I'm the Manager of Regulatory Services here in Newmarket. And I'm here to conduct a presentation with you today in terms of the mobile business licensing regime. Looking at some current regulations we have pertaining to mobile business classifications and perhaps some new proposed regulations worth consideration based on best practices of other communities and some information we've gathered. So like Director Lyons mentioned, you do have your clickers. I just ask that when it comes up to a clicker question, just hold off answering until I can just clarify the question, and then I'll walk you through how it's used. So they're already turned on. You don't have to do anything for that. There'll be a few questions throughout the presentation, and they'll come in and out in between information. So we'll get right into it. So to start, what is a mobile business? The definition would be a business that provides goods and or services to the public from a vehicle or apparatus that is designed to be mobile, including but not limited to a cart or concession stand. For the purpose of clarity, mobile business does not include a stall at a farmer's market, a business which uses a motor vehicle only as a means to physically transport goods and or services to a customer or to obtain goods from a supplier, and any other form of business that is restricted from regulation by a municipality under the Municipal Act. That's a big mouthful of a legal definition. So put simply, to understand what a mobile business is and whether or not that business classification falls under this definition, you should ask yourself two questions. So one, are you a courier service? An example would be FedEx delivering a package somewhere. Under the Municipal Act, you're not required to have a local government business license to conduct that business, so you would be exempt. The second question you'd want to ask yourself is, do you use your business for do you use your vehicle for transportation purposes? So are you going from point A to point B and then going to conduct business? An example would be of that would be a landscaper, a construction worker, a mobile nurse who goes to residents' homes. You would be exempt from this classification as well. So I've put some pictures up just on some general classifications that I will speak to today in my presentation, and that we have boards around the room for further information. So just as a general overview, I'll go into the background of today's presentation. I'll discuss the purpose of why we're discussing mobile business classifications. I'll get a little more specific into certain classifications, so looking at transportation network companies. I'll refer to them as TNCs. An example of this would be the Ubers and Lyfts of the world. I'll speak to taxi cabs in that industry. I'll also reference the tow truck industry. And I'll discuss some other classifications briefly, and we also have, like I said, stations around to go further in depth following my presentation. So just as a bit of background, in March of this year, a regulatory review workshop was conducted between town staff and mayor and council. And this was to identify bylaws and timelines for review in terms of regulations that were going to come forward. During that conversation, TNCs, taxi cabs, and tow trucks were all identified in this project plan. So the purpose of today's Public Information Center is to provide information regarding these classifications of mobile businesses, to discuss a fair and consistent approach to upcoming regulations or best practices within other municipalities, to recognize different business models, understanding that while some industries may share similarities, so for example, TNCs and taxis, they do have different business models, so providing their own classification of business is important. And to consider regulations or reviewing current regulations to see where we want to go moving forward. So pull out your clickers and we'll just do a little icebreaker. I have 5 or 6 questions just to warm you up. So the first question is an easy one. Do you live in Newmarket? So if you do, click the first button, which is A or 1. If you don't live in the Newmarket area, click B or no. And you just point it at the screen up at the front there. So just give it a couple more seconds. Everyone's in. So you can see the outcome. A large number of you here today aren't from Newmarket specifically. So let's try one a little more in depth. So which best describes you? So are you here today associated with the taxi industry? You would click A or 1. If you're associated with a TNC, so Uber or Lyft, you would push B. If you're a member of the public just looking for input, you would press C. And if you're associated with another type of mobile business that I haven't identified on this list, you would press D. Let's go ahead and vote. Everyone's in. Right, so you can see a large number here today is from another type of classification. So that being said, if you selected D, if you are associated with another classification, which would best describe you? Are you here representing limousine services, driving school instructors, refreshment vehicles, tow trucks, another mobile business I haven't identified? And if on the previous slide you've already said you're a member of the public, a TNC or taxi, you can select F for not applicable. So go ahead and vote. All right. So you can see there's 44% of that 75% that belongs to the tow truck industry. So very informative. And just so you know, if you happen to click the wrong button, you can change your answer and it won't mark you twice. So if you slip, that's okay. So whether you own a vehicle or not, when you're not driving, which type of ride surface do you prefer personally? So do you use public transit? Do you use a TNC like an Uber or a Lyft? Do you use a taxi, or do you refer to friends or someone you know and trust? You can submit your answers. All right. Yeah. Everyone's in? All right. So you can see people rely on friends they know, but they also rely on the TNC industry. That's quite a large number considering we don't currently have regulations for TNCs here in Newmarket. So I just have a couple more questions before going into the presentation. This is in reference to accessible transportation. So do you or someone you live with or support require accessible transportation services? I'm waiting on, oh, there we go. So this is just good feedback to understand, the needs of our community. So further to that question, how do you rate the current accessible transportation services, whether private or public modes, here in Newmarket? So if it's not applicable to you, you can select E. Otherwise, just rate your experience so far. So for the most part, not applicable to the members in this room. So I'm going to jump into a specific classification, which is transportation network companies, so TNCs. So what is a TNC? It's an organization, whether a partnership, corporation, sole proprietor, that provides prearranged transportation services for compensation using an online-enabled application or platform to connect passengers with drivers using their personal vehicles. Put simply, this is the general business model of a TNC, if you're not familiar with it. So it's a prearranged transportation service using an app or a platform, and a driver will be contacted using their personal vehicle. So someone will go on the app, book a service. The payment is cashless, so it's done directly through the app. A driver will come, oftentimes in an unmarked vehicle. And once you've completed your ride, like I said, there's no payment, and from there you can rate your driver, and your driver has an opportunity to rate you based on your profile on that app. So everything is done through the application. And I know I reference it, I'm guilty of referencing it myself. I always refer to TNCs as Uber and Lyft, but it's important to recognize that there are many other TNCs throughout the world, but also right here in Ontario. So there's Uber and Lyft, which are frequent throughout Canada. There's Rideco, that's known in the Waterloo region. There's Blank Ride, which is in the GTA and surrounding area, and there's also Drive Her. So we're starting to see this industry grow in terms of new businesses coming forward that would fall under this classification. So this slide here is just a comparison, and it's important, like I said prior, to understand different business models. And so what I've done is done a comparison between TNCs and taxis for your reference and understanding. So while they both offer transportation services to riders, they do have different models. So the technology used through TNCs, the ride is often is only arranged through the app. With taxis, there's the option for a phone-in dispatch. There's an online booking, and we are starting to see in other communities the use of an app as well. The driver screening is done through the company directly, through the TNC, whereas with taxis, it's regulated that they're required to come through the municipality. In terms of a rating system, you often see TNCs doing what I just mentioned on the previous slide. So they rate the driver rates the rider, and vice versa. Whereas whereas with taxis, it's typically an online review. So the same you would rate a business online, write a review for. Again, we are starting to see through application as well, some taxi industries in other municipalities are moving into the rating system. In terms of payment, TNCs are cashless only through the app. Taxis offer cash, credit, or debit once the ride is complete. In terms of fares, TNC has a dynamic pricing model. And what I mean by that is they're not bound by regulation to charge per kilometer or a set rate. What they do is offer a flat fee prior to you selecting that booking, and you confirm that prior to your ride. So it's a set fee. This is dynamic for them because on a slow day, they might have the opportunity to lower their rates to encourage business. Whereas with taxis, it's set by regulation. It's set by the municipality by bylaw. So there's a tariff. So when you first enter a taxi, there's already an amount applied, a fee applied before starting. And then there's a per kilometer rate that's charged, which is also set by legislation. In terms of transporting passengers, in TNCs, it's a personal vehicle that's used. Taxis, it's commercial. Arranging for a ride, like I mentioned, it's done through the app. In taxis, it can be online, it can be a phone-in dispatch, or it can be hailing it directly on the street. In terms of the employment classification of the drivers, typically in TNCs, you'll see both part-time and full-time, and that's dynamic. And what I mean by that is someone has an opportunity to sign up and go through the motions to become registered as a driver on the app. They might need to make some extra money for a short period of time, so they could conduct drives for, say, a week, and then they could go off of the app. And then 6 months down the road, they might find that they want to make some extra cash, go back on the app, drive again, and jump off as they please. This is speaking in generalities, but mostly for the taxi industry, you'll see both part-time and full-time drivers, but it's predominantly full-time. So if they're going through the motions of being licensed and and complying with the regulations of the municipality, they're driving on a regular basis. In terms of insurance, taxis require commercial insurance, and there is a general misconception with TNCs. I've heard it myself that Uber drivers aren't required to have commercial insurance. That's not actually the case. The insurance is just structured differently. So Uber or Lyft or the TNC company will have insurance, and it will be commercial, and that's activated once a ride is initiated. So from the time the driver picks you up to the time they drop you off, they're covered under commercial liability right through the company itself. Once that ride's complete, it goes back to their personal insurance. So they are covered on commercial. So in saying all of that, the reason I was doing the comparison chart is to show that generally TNC, the TNC model, the business model, doesn't comply not only with Newmarket's taxi licensing bylaw, but we're finding this around other municipalities across the world. So it just doesn't fit in that classification box, which is why we need to establish regulations for a new classification under the Mobile Business License Bylaw. And it's important to note the impact that this new classification has had. The town's highly regulated taxi industry is facing competition from new platforms, and they're only going to continue to grow. We're seeing more and more businesses come into this industry. So when considering a licensing regime, there's some important considerations. Ensuring consumer protection and addressing those concerns, so driver screening and vehicle safety. Addressing accessibility concerns. There's a responsibility of all local governments to provide accessible transportation, so looking at ways that these businesses and classifications can comply with regulations as well. It's important that the town stay familiar and modernize standards, so keeping up with ever-changing businesses and the different models that they introduced into our community. There's considerations that we're seeing around other municipalities as well in terms of licensing companies and brokers versus the drivers. So not licensing individual drivers in TNCs, but just licensing the business itself and holding that business accountable for its staff. And ultimately, additionally, cost recovery for town services. These businesses are operating within the town using town infrastructure, and it's important that that burden's not placed on the taxpayer, that these businesses are held accountable financially for the impact they're having in our community. So pull out your clicker. We'll do another question. So how often do you use a TNC? So if you've used an Uber or Lyft before, have you used it once a week, once a month, several times a month? never or rarely, you can click D. So quite rarely. That's surprising. So another question for you. What types of regulations would you like to see TNCs comply with? So what's important to you? Is it driver security checks and clearances, vehicle safety certifications, holding that commercial insurance? Are all of them important to you? Are none of them important to you? I'm missing 3 more. All right, we'll close it. So all of these are important considerations to everyone in this room or most of you in this room, regarding upcoming regulations. So just as an overview of the municipal response to TNCs coming into communities, here's a list, I won't go through them, but of local governments close by within Ontario that have already imposed legislation. So they're already regulating TNCs in their respective communities. We're also aware of other municipalities that are currently in the process of proposing regulations. Again, I won't go through this in too much detail, but this is just a comparison chart of larger municipalities. I've even included Edmonton to show that it's right across Canada in terms of TNC regulations and some of the consistencies and patterns we're seeing throughout the municipalities. So in terms of enforcement and data collection, most of the municipalities in the research that's been conducted has showed that municipalities have moved to an audit system. So they place the onus on the company to ensure that the driver screening has been collected, the annual background checks and so forth, and then the municipality will move to an audit system to ensure that they're in compliance and require these documents to be submitted on an annual basis. Again, you can see here, there seems to be a movement to not regulate fares, allow them that dynamic pricing model. But ultimately to maintain that safety component, so ensuring that there's annual safeties in the criminal record checks, again through an auditing system, but still making that a requirement. So just wrapping up on TNCs, some of the consultation and feedback that's been conducted with neighboring municipalities, as well as some from throughout Ontario, there seems to be a need or a push to regulate and ensure that there's annual record checks and driver's information, so that safety component. The initial background checks are still being conducted. There's vehicle inspections, again, through that third-party audit system. Ensuring there's up-to-date safety standard certifications, imposing regulations in terms of vehicle age, so the average is about 7 to 10 years until that vehicle is no longer permitted to be a part of that business and operate. Making sure there's valid insurance, so commercial insurance is in place, and maintaining consumer protection features. So what seems to be common best practice in a lot of municipalities is rather than some of these TNCs having signage, so illuminated signage like you would see on a taxi, it's right on the app. So they're requiring that the app be able to display the license plate number, the driver's name, and the vehicle information so that the consumer, when waiting for their ride, can double check and verify that the vehicle they're getting into is the accurate vehicle and they have the correct information. So taxis. So what is a taxi cab? I'm not going to read this out, but this is how we define a taxi. So it's the transportation of passengers. Currently, the town of Newmarket has 2 licensed companies or brokers here that are fully licensed. So pull out your clickers. So tell me, how often do you use a taxi cab? once a week, once a month, several times a month, never or rarely. All right, so similar to the TNC response. Everyone's a driver here. All right, so looking at, so the town currently does regulate the taxi industry. So looking at some of the current regulations. So I haven't pulled out all of our regulations, but I have pulled out some key regulations that are in place. And so the next few slides, I'm just going to briefly go through each point there and talk about what are some of the best practices in other municipalities in terms of this licensing regime. So some considerations. So there's a lot of consideration on the licensing of brokers and drivers. So right now, the town of Newmarket licenses both. So the company and the individual drivers need to hold a Newmarket license. So there's consideration we're seeing in other communities on only licensing brokers rather than the drivers themselves. Again, holding the company responsible for its staff rather than having the municipality license individual drivers that way. So this would be consistent with TNCs and would create equal opportunities for those drivers in their respective classifications. So, time to use the survey equipment. So how do you feel about what I just said? So should the town license taxi companies rather than the individual drivers? This would hold the taxi companies responsible, not the drivers. All right, so the majority of you said yes. Some of you are impartial. So the second regulation that the town of Newmarket currently has is set tariffs and fares. So like I mentioned earlier, there's a set rate that's automatically applied before you even begin your trip. And then there's a per kilometer fee as you take your trip, and then at the end you'll get your total. So there's consideration right now to remove the tariffs and set fares, and this is a practice we're seeing in other municipalities. The rationale is that it would equal the playing field for all ride service providers by no longer requiring that set rate. So what we're seeing is, as mentioned previously, TNCs know that there's a set rate for taxis, so they will often undercut. So they will make their prices lower so that they can be competitive and increase their ridership. By regulating one and not the other, there's an inconsistency. So what we're seeing in other municipalities is to remove that and allow dynamic pricing. That would go hand in hand with other regulations that would follow, because we want to ensure that it doesn't escalate in price and they start raising their prices and it becomes unfortunate for the consumer. So there would be other regulations that are being proposed, and that would look something like the set rate. So you're being disclosed what the fare would be prior to confirming the ride, and so you're aware. That would go hand in hand with the meters. So the set meters that are currently in taxis, there's consideration to remove the set meters and allow for adjustable fares. So there could be a digital meter or a tablet app installed in the taxi, and it would allow them to flex that pricing, maybe lower their price on a slower night to encourage ridership and so forth. So using your clickers, how do you feel about what I just said? Should the town allow competitive pricing models for taxi cabs rather than regulating those set rates? Right. So by doing so, it would allow that competitive pricing model. So a couple other current regulations that the town of Newmarket has set in their bylaws is illuminated signage. So the sign that you see at the top of the taxi. Research conducted with other municipalities would suggest to maintain that signage. And the rationale is not only to differentiate them and establish them, but the purpose is also to ensure that the consumer knows which vehicle they're entering. So like I mentioned previous, with a TNC, it's solely through an app, so we can put regulations in place to require the license plate number be provided to the rider, as well as the vehicle make, model, and the driver's name. Taxis don't necessarily solely run on an application. They might introduce applications, but there's also the phone-in dispatch and the online booking. So there would be no way for the rider to confirm the vehicle they're getting into, and this is why we'd encourage, or other municipalities are encouraging, to leave illuminated signage so that the vehicle's marked. As well, there's another regulation in terms of annual vehicle inspections, and best practices suggest maintaining that, again, for that safety component to ensure that the vehicles are safe for operation. And finally, just some general consumer protection features. So maintaining features such as the vehicle age restrictions, mechanical safety inspections, driver background checks, valid insurance, and so forth. So, you know, the ultimate goal of the regulations is ensuring safety is the top priority. So in summary on the taxi cab industry, there's consideration not only in this municipality but others as well when establishing regulations to allow taxi cabs a competitive pricing model, to review licensing fees and what that structure looks like, to regulate or allow only the taxi industry to conduct hail rides. So because their vehicles are marked, they would have the only access to being able to have somebody hail them down, wave them down, and start a ride that way rather than through an app. Maintaining vehicle safety, again, through an audit system, maintaining signage requirements, and just maintaining general consumer protection features, but having consideration in removing individual licensing and moving to just the broker or the company. Tow trucks. Looks like a lot of you in here. So what is a tow truck? A tow truck is a vehicle used for towing or otherwise conveying of a vehicle or vehicles. I'll apologize ahead of time. I've already spoken to some of you, so you may not be inclusive on this list. But this is just a general information on known tow trucks throughout York Region here. So it's important to note that there are currently no regulations in Newmarket pertaining to tow trucks. So there are considerations for new regulations. So what we've seen in other municipalities as best practices or recommendations has been to establish a licensing regime, to look at insurance requirements, to consider capped fees or rates, so only allowing tow trucks to charge up to a certain amount, to ensure proper data retention, so this would include logbooks, location drop-off records, costs, in the event anyone needed to go back or the town needed to conduct an audit. Vehicle safety inspection reports, and general consumer protection features. So looking at storage criteria, the disclosure of rates and fees, proper certifications, police background checks, and so forth. Some additional considerations or recommendations or seen best practices in other municipalities would be storage operators to be regulated. So introducing regulations pertaining to storage operators. Of course, I'm here speaking about the mobile business licensing regime, so this would be conducted in a separate bylaw. Another consideration is having regulations that provide authorization by the owner, unless it's a police tow. So making sure there's consent to tow the vehicle prior to towing it. Another consideration would be quotes for services. So what we're seeing is usually within a 10% range, providing the customer with a quote prior to conducting the services. Offering dynamic payment options, so cash, credit, or debit. And operators must hold a valid CVOR, so ensuring proper certifications are in place. So, time to use the survey equipment. So, how do you feel about what I just said? Should the town implement a cap on tow truck rates and additional fees? So, only allowing tow trucks to charge up to a certain amount. So, overwhelming yes. So, a follow up question regarding tow trucks, which regulation is most important to you? That tow trucks provide estimates, so the cost for towing, that there's proper insurance or vehicle inspections, that there's consent to tow the vehicle prior to. Are all of these important to you? Are none of them important to you? You can choose now. So all of these consumer protection features are clearly important to everyone in this room, or most of you in this room. So there's other mobile business classifications that would meet the definition I spoke to earlier. So currently, the town of Newmarket regulates driving school instructors and refreshment vehicles, and those are in individual and separate bylaws. These bylaws went through extensive consultation. They're recent bylaws, and because they meet this definition of a mobile business classification, they would essentially be amalgamated into, the regulations would be brought forward into a new mobile business licensing bylaw. So it's important to note that they are coming forward, and we're certainly open to recommendations, some feedback, just looking to garner information on how the regulations have been your experience. So if you'd like to provide input, we will have booths set up where you can comment or conduct a survey and provide some further information on those. The town of Newmarket currently does not regulate limousine services. So this is another classification that would meet that definition of a mobile business. And so the town is looking to explore regulations for this classification. Currently, we're just gathering feedback and input, and we're also looking at best practices throughout other municipalities. And so some of the feedback we've received has been focusing on consumer protection. So, of course, safety is a top priority. Ensuring valid licensing, so valid driver's licenses and vehicle certifications, and obtaining the proper permits from other governing bodies. Again, we will have a booth set up, so if you're looking for more information or want to provide some comments and feedback, you can head to that respective booth. So just a couple more slides here before I finish, just walking you through what the process has been and what next steps will look like for all of these classifications. So as I mentioned, back in March, the regulatory review was conducted. Consultation has been ongoing with different industries throughout the summer. I'm here tonight before you, presenting the PIC in an effort to gather stakeholder and public input. We're planning to do further consultation, so check in with each of the industries we spoke to and reaching out to others to follow up in terms of feedback and any information you'd like to discuss regarding upcoming regulations that may be proposed. And once receiving that information, a draft bylaw will be proposed to council in Q1 of 2020. So if you're interested to know when a report and the bylaw will be presented, you can sign up with staff today and we'll keep you informed. So just following my presentation here, I put a picture of one of our booths. So you're welcome to walk around and complete the surveys, provide feedback on the comment cards, or just take a look around. Additional information, if anyone you know couldn't make it tonight or you have to head out early, there's an online survey available at newmarket.ca under news and notices. And I just ask that prior to walking around, you just take your clicker and hand it back to one of our staff so that we make sure we grab it off you. Thank you.